Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Miller. I'm the head of archives and special collections at the UC Davis Library. I wanted to start by thanking the ABAA and the BSA for inviting our library to provide the special exhibit at this year's book fair. It was a real honor and a privilege and a lot of fun to put it together. If you haven't seen it already, please do. It's at the other end of the hall, and it explores our wine and grape collections at UC Davis. And that's what we're going to hear about today from two perspectives. From my colleagues Axel Borg and Christine Cheng. And I want to thank them as well as Julianne Ballou for helping me curate that exhibit, which was a real team effort. So starting with an introduction for Christine, who will be speaking second. So Christine is our Instruction and Outreach Librarian for Archives and Special Collections at the University of California, Davis. She designs library services and educational programs that enhance access to an understanding of rare books, manuscripts, and archive materials. Her interests are promoting and developing skills in primary source literacy. So in other words, Christine plays that critical role in connecting our material with students at the university and interpreting that material for them. Axel Borg, a little bit about him. So after graduating from Sonoma College in 1976, Axel was commissioned into the United States Army as an armor officer. In 1983, he left the Army to become a librarian. Axel earned his MLIS at UC Berkeley and served as an agricultural librarian at Berkeley. In 1986, Axel took a position as a general science librarian at UC Santa Cruz. And in 1988, he began his service at UC Davis as the Wine and Food Science Bibliographer. So he's been around the UC system. While at UC Davis, Axel worked with Professor Maynard A. Amering and was co-author of his last work, a bibliography on grapes, wine, and other alcoholic beverages and temperance, published in the United States before 1901. And that was published by the UC Press. Axel retired from UC Davis after 37 years of service as a librarian in the UC system, and we've been very privileged that over 30 of those years were with us at UC Davis, during which he's built the collection that he'll be talking to you about today. So please, we're going to hold all questions for both speakers until the end of the program, and help me welcome Axel Borg.
Thank you, Kevin, for that very nice introduction. And I'm going to take my mask off so that I'm not speaking through that. It's been my privilege to work with a really remarkable collection, the finest grape-growing winemaking collection in the world. And wait a minute. Why is it? Let's see. So, the grape-growing and winemaking collection can be dated to 1880. There we go. Can be dated to 1880. When the California State Legislature charged the University of California with doing research in the area of grape growing and winemaking, and specifically it was in response to the phylloxera crisis of the 1880s. But the person who is the most responsible for the collection and the excellence in the collection is really Dr. Maynard Amering. This is a portrait of him taken by Ansel Adams as part of a portfolio that was done documenting the University of California campuses. He arrived in the 30s, and anytime a librarian has the opportunity to work with a faculty member, especially a faculty member who's very concerned about the collections in their area, that's a really wonderful opportunity. But in this case, it lasted 50 years. Now, not with me, but with a previous librarian. So he took with previous librarians. So he really took an interest in the grape and wine collection to the point where he would actively solicit collections from various people to come to Davis. He was a bibliophile himself. He was a member of the Book Club of California. He was also a member of a number of food and wine societies. He is the most significant wine scientist in the United States, and he passed away in 1998. His writings encompassed everything from the popular to the scientific on this. So I want to tell you a little bit about the collection and what the collection does. The collection supports the Amarine room, where a good portion of the collection, about 2/3 of the collection, is housed, is on the 3rd floor in Shields Library, and so it's named for Dr. Maynard Amarine. The remaining part is in special collections, and there is material that is stored off-site in the Northern Regional Library facility. We have a fair amount of Slavic language publications that are there in the NRLF. But the collection itself is designed to support the academic and research programs at the University of California, Davis, and the University of California at Davis has the Viticulture and Enology Department, which is a world-renowned department in grape growing and winemaking. It's the only department anywhere in the world where the pomologists, the grape growers, were taken out of pomology, and the winemakers were taken out of food science and put together in one department. It's currently paired with the food science department in the Robert Mondavi Institute, and I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. So we support the academic and research programs. And just as a note, there was a question in the earlier program about about consumption of alcohol by underage people. We do have students in the Viticulture and Enology program that are not 21 yet, but a special legislation by the California legislature allows those students who are under 21 who are matriculated in a program to taste wine as part of that program. So there's a special carve-out for them. We also support the Cooperative Extension Program, which is that's supporting the industry and the winemakers and the grape growers out in California. We also support University Extension, which is continuing education. We are a resource that supports national and international users, and then the wine industry in general. And while the California is a relatively new into wine in the sense of comparison to Europe, and we really only date back to the Spanish fathers, the scientific involvement in wine is marked by Louis Pasteur and his work in the 1860s. And so it was in the 1860s the university first began to do some work in wine. University of California was founded in 1868, and by 1880 was formally doing programs. So we've been involved as long as anybody has in terms of the science side of it. So we're heirs to a long and glorious tradition here in California and in the world. 1880 California Assembly Bill starts that, and then in 1887, first formal courses at Davis. 1908, first courses at UC Davis. In 1919, the Department of Viticulture is established, and in 1954, the present Department of Viticulture at UC Davis is in place. Davis becomes a separate campus in the UC system in 1959. And that is, let's go back just a second. That is in the Robert Mondavi Institute for Food and Wine Science at UC Davis. And it also houses the Food Science Department. So the Food Science Department and the Viticulture and Enology Department are together in one building, designed to create sort of a collaborative collaborative environment for the students and the faculty. And winemaking students, I've known, or a lot of the winemaking students that I've known have also taken the brewing class and know how to make beer, and vice versa. So there is sort of this cross mingling on that. So, mentioned that About a third of the collection is in the Archives and Special Collections. And here we see a picture of the Archives and Special Collections reading room. We're not an ivory tower organization in the sense that we don't reach out to industry. We don't have strong industry use of things, and that includes going into special collections from industry. There's a story that apparently, well, I was told it happened before I arrived, and it involved a lawsuit between the Gallo brothers. And so the story is that there were archives that had been donated by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Department of the federal government, and attorneys on both sides were using the same boxes in archives and special collections. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but it does make for a nice story. So what is this collection? What constitutes the collection? It's a RLG level 5 collection. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that RLG designation, it's essentially a way for institutions to evaluate the nature of their collection, the status of their collection, how good it is. And we're at level 4, you're able to support all teaching and research done in any advanced institution in the United States. So level 5 is something beyond that. I like to think of it as sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of material. This is currently the earliest item that we have. This is something that was purchased by Special Collections. It's from the Andre Simone collection. It's an excerpt from Encyclopedia. And you know, when I think about these books, because I've been working with them for so long, in many ways I begin to think of them as family, maybe even children. This was the first really rare book that I purchased when I started at UC Davis. And at the time, it was, we were told by the dealer, and it seemed to verify in the records that we were able to look into, that there were only 2 other known copies of this book, and it was at the time understood to be the earliest item in French on wine. It's actually in Middle French. Note the date of 1549. The 2 other copies, one's in the British Library and one's in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And the British Library copy and our copy were 1549, and the Bibliothèque Nationale's copy was 1550. So we beat them by a year. Now, since the advent of widespread digitizing of catalogs, there's another 12 or 13 copies that have been located. So it's not quite as rare as it was, but I still think of it as one of my children in a sense. This was thought to be the earliest item on Tokaj wine. Tokaj wine is a famous wine of Hungary, and it's a doctoral dissertation, 1758. And when this came on the market, we bought it, but we also thought, well, let's see if we can raise some money to help offset the cost. And so we went to a couple of organizations that we thought might be interested in contributing to this, and I won't name names, but their response was, well, do you have the item? And we said, well, yeah, actually we do. We've gotten it from the dealer. And they said, well, just photocopy it and send it back. Why would you spend that amount of money on that? Now, since then, Ben Kinmont found an earlier work, I think it's about 10, 12 years earlier than this, on Tokaj wine. It's actually on Hungarian wine. It's in German, which is interesting, but the biggest section of that pamphlet is on Tokaj wine, so we've got a little bit earlier thing. This is the thing with bibliography. There's always somebody that will best you out there, and I think it's actually pretty good. And there it is. That's now the oldest item. All of the early works on Tokai wine, with the exception of this one, have been digitized and are available through the library. So you can go to our catalog, look up the record, and it will take you to a digital version of the item so you can look at it. This one we will get digitized at some point, so we'll have that up also. This is a Spanish book. It's interesting because at this point in time, in the 1840s in Spain, there was an effort going on within Spain to improve the quality of both wine and olive oil, because quality had suffered sort of in the post-Napoleonic world of Spain. So this is an important early work in terms of the Spanish wine industry. I said a little bit about the RLG rating on the collection, just some sort of bibliometric numbers on it. We're roughly about 35,000 volumes in the collection, with about a third in special collections, which I said. We have over 325 serial titles in the collection, and we have 50 languages that I've been able to identify in the collection. I am still searching for 51. And one of those 50 is a language that is not recognized by the Library of Congress as one of their languages. So it's not officially recognized, but otherwise there's 49 languages recognized by Library of Congress, and then that other language, which is a Serbo-Croatian language. It's primarily technical and historical, with quite a bit, but not, I'd like to get more economic information in that area. It includes serials, books, pamphlets, maps, printed ephemera like wine labels and advertising, and you'll see all of these examples of all of these kinds of things in our exhibit, which is on the other side of the hall. Posters, original artwork, there's illustrations of hand painted vines and things like that that would be used as the basis for work in books. And I just got my 15-minute notice, and so I'm going to move along. There are a number of collections that came from elsewhere that were given to us. This is an example of one of those. This particular book this particular plate is from the first ampelography in the state of California, and this particular illustration is Zinfandel grapes, and the idea, an ampelography is designed to help you identify grapevines, and so the artist wants to portray all of the qualities of those grapes so that you can then identify that particular variety. It's an intersection of science and art. And for those of you that are familiar with the Zinfandel grape, it's a problematic grape because it's got uneven ripening, and you can see in the illustration overripe and underripe berries. This particular book is an interesting one because it is the first technical book printed in California on winemaking in 1883. We also have a French book. Now, the Wine Press and Cellar Manual, the one that you're seeing up there, is the reproduction that was done by the Robert Mondavi Institute of the original work. And it's a fascinating piece and a story in itself, but that will have to wait for another day. That funding to reproduce that book was from Fritz Maytag of Anchor Steam Brewing. So, this is a remarkable book, a unique book. It was put together by the Natoma Vineyards, which is a company located roughly in the Aerojet region of Sacramento. If you go out 50 towards Folsom, you'll pass that. These are actually pressed leaves from their vineyards. They had the largest vineyard in the world at the time. They were attempting to grow all sorts of different grape varieties in the Central Valley. It tended to produce terrible wine, but the grapes looked great. There are actual leaves that were pressed into it. This book was then donated or given to the state or to the Board of State Viticulture Commissioners, so it came in as part of that library. The Whimsical, the pop-up book of wine. This was a Hugh Johnson production. You'll see this one on exhibit out there. We also have it in German. We tend to collect in as many different languages as possible. So if something was originally, say, in English and translated into German or French, we would try and get those copies also. Roy Brady, if you were here for the earlier talk by Julianne Ballou, Roy Brady was a wine writer in Southern California. We have his papers at Davis. This was a book that he did with the Santa Susana Press at Cal State Northridge. And it's a fine press book, an artist's book in the collection. This is an example of photographs that we have in the collection. This photograph, which is of Zinfandel, was taken at the Oakville Station. Oakville Station is part of the university property, but it is in Napa. It is within the boundaries of the Tokelon vineyard. Tokelon is the earliest or oldest named vineyard in the state of California. It's a prime grape area. It's just recently been designated as a historic location. In 1915, these were photographed for the Panama Pacific exhibition that was held in San Francisco. And the interesting thing about this is that when you look at the history of the Panama Pacific Exposition, there's no mention of anything about wine. And that's because it was written during Prohibition, the history was. You have to go back to contemporary newspaper accounts and it will tell you about a wine pavilion that was there, and the entryway was lined with these photographs. So the Oakville Station is two 20-acre plots of land in Napa, in the prime grape-growing area of Napa, that belong to the University of California, specifically to the department, which is another thing that makes it so unique. No other institution in the world has prime grape land for its students and faculty to work with. Thank you. And I want to thank my timer for keeping me on time, roughly. And so we're going to hold questions till the end. And all of what I've shown you only exists to be used. So Christine's going to talk about how she's getting the word out on our collection. And that, from my perspective, that's the most important part of all of this. So, and wait a minute, I will make sure I'm not taking something of yours. Am I?
I hope not.
Nope.
I'll also be flying by
Yeah,
my pants.
there you go.
Hello. So nice to be here with you all and to be able to gather in largest groups again. I'm Christine Cheng, the Instruction and Outreach Librarian for Archives and Special Collections, which I would argue and will argue is the coolest and best part of UC Davis Library. And since this presentation is being recorded, I just wanted to make sure I would go on record for that. All right, but before I go into discussing the materiality of the items in the context of instruction, I want to go over a brief outline of my presentation. I'll give you a snapshot of what instruction looks like in special collections, as well as the approach that I take to teaching. I'll provide some examples of the specific classes that visit special collections the most frequently, and then I'll dive into particular items under books and themes and manuscripts before arriving at the end. In terms of background and what instruction looks like in archives and special collections at UC Davis, I provide a couple of word clouds. And the first word cloud represents the unit of special collections from when we first collected instructional statistics in 2003 And then the word cloud next to that is from when I started at UC Davis in 2016, the classes that I personally handled. And these classes are divided by subject code according to the academic departments. As you can see with special collections, we've had a history largely of classes from the design departments, art history, English history, Native American and Studies departments that visit us. With me, you'll see a lot of overlap with art history classes, English, again, history and design classes, but we also have a lot of classes now from our first year seminar. And a lot of subjects and classes that visit special collections vary under the title of first year seminars. If you notice in red, VEN, the viticulture and enology classes, at least when I started, they began coming into special collections consistently. They come in at least once every academic year, if not twice. In terms of collecting items, selection criteria, I will look at adding to the collection with an eye towards instruction. The criteria that comes to mind is the benefit to and the item's utility in the classroom, to student assignments, student projects, and to student and faculty research. So under those guidelines and also other conditions, how then to incorporate these materials into lesson planning? Those conditions include a lot of our students that come in and visit special collections in their classes are, for the majority, undergraduate students. A lot of these instruction sessions are one-shots. That means that for the most part, there are no repeat visits in classes after the first initial session. And they're mostly courses from art history, English, design, and the first year seminars. So if our collecting focus, one of our collecting strengths is in viticulture enology, how then do I incorporate the materials into the rest of the curriculum? When I was designing and organizing the first student-led library tasting, I was working with the chair of Vitus, the student-led wine tasting organization, and asked, why is it that students don't make use of our materials, or that why is it that classes don't, a lot of E&E classes don't visit special collections? And she mentioned that, well, our materials are largely outdated and erroneous. So under those guidelines, under those conditions, I ask again, how then to incorporate these materials into the rest of the curriculum? But before I go into that, let's talk about the state of instruction in special collections. My style of teaching is not very lecture-based or didactic. I don't have a classroom where it's traditionally the lecturer providing the information and the students receiving that information. I make use of active learning techniques, primarily focusing on student-centered learning. I make use of backward design approach in active learning, where you focus on the learning goals, the course instructor's goals and objectives, and then working backwards from that point in planning the lesson and selecting the items to use in class. So from an article from 1991 on active learning, it's based on instruction activities that involve students in doing things and think about what they're doing, rather than having the students passively learn, receive information. The focus is on developing student skills and using primary sources through reading, discussing, and writing. I don't interpret the materials for the students. I am a facilitator of leading them to make those interpretations, to make those analyses. The classroom is there to serve as more of a research laboratory to tap into the students' investigative skills, right? So I'm focusing on hands-on learning. The students, rather than knowledge receivers, are knowledge producers. I already mentioned developing their skills and being successful with analyzing and examining, well, all the skills required in primary source literacy and making the classroom, turning it into a research laboratory. And combining the instructor's goals, I also keep in mind the guidelines for primary source literacy. These guidelines were developed by a joint task force between the Society of American Archivists and the Rare Books and Manuscripts section of ACRL. And together, these guidelines broadly articulate the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed by students to successfully conceptualize, find, analyze, and use primary sources. So you can either focus on one of these objectives or use a combination of the objectives. So you are developing students, teaching them how to conceptualize primary sources, find and access them, read, understand and summarize them, interpret, analyze, and evaluate, use and incorporate them. And I promised showing examples of the types of classes that visit us from the art history, English departments. So the first year seminars, you have everything focusing on from pop culture to poverty, always the history of bookmaking. Those could be English, history, or comparative literature classes. You have classes from form and color, letter forms and type. This is where we make use of our artist books, right? Classes focusing on typography, on structure and format of materials. And before I dive into the specific items, I ask that you bring yourself back to when you were undergraduates, particularly, well, before you were erudite scholars in all things rare books. Think back to your first and second years of your undergraduate experiences. You are for the first time handling, smelling a manuscript from the 13th century on vellum. Now we can jump in. So, chocolate Enda was actually introduced to me first by Axel here. And from that point, it led me to form connections to other items in our collections that I can then show and present to students. You have Chocolate Enda from 1644, which is actually a Latin translation from a work in the Spanish vernacular. And then beside that, I paired it with a facsimile of the Codex Nuttall, so a pre-Columbian, pre-Hispanic fanfold or screenfold book. From Chocolate Enda, I can present the frontispiece to students, focusing on how it's a copper plate engraving of a Native American representing the New World, presenting chocolate, if you notice, in its solid form, to the Old World, represented by Neptune. But besides that, you can focus and make analyses of the physical characteristics, such as pagination, or in this case, the lack thereof, signature marks, catchwords, spine, and overall binding, as well as a printer's error. Below it, I connected that to Codex Nuttall, where this is the facsimile of the manuscript. The original lives at the British Museum, originally on deer hide. But in this, you see a pictogram of a marriage ceremony, the bride presenting her groom with a cup of chocolate, showing how chocolate was originally consumed in its liquid form, in with a bitter taste, with its reddish hue and a frothy head. And I'm going to be incorporating chocolate because, as Robert Mondavi said, wine is food. Wine is a grocery item. So naturally, there's no way I'm going to talk about wine collections without including food as well. So along the same veins of food and chocolate, we have Bitter Chocolate, an artist book by Julie Chen. Now, how do I describe the materiality of items in 2D format? I created a little video showing the container of bitter chocolate. That's supposed to resemble a chocolate bar, but some students say it's a box that might contain a wine bottle. But you have two sides, which actually presents 4 distinct presentations of content. Julie uses a combination of the Jacob's ladder structure with an accordion fold. So the first side, unsweetened, you are presented with two different narratives. And then when you flip it over to untempered, the second side, you have the final two narratives. So this is a way to show students how to present information, more than one or a couple narratives, depending on what structures you use. And this includes historical myth and also myths of chocolate, focuses on the cacao woman, as well as the author's or the artist's own personal experiences in creating bitter chocolate. With my Renaissance, medieval to Renaissance art classes, I like to show them fragments, examples of medieval manuscripts. This is where we focus on illuminated manuscripts, focusing on the differences between historiated and decorated initials. But it's also important to show not everything from the medieval period is an illuminated manuscript. So I largely use the Will of Jimenez, as an example of what's not an illuminated manuscript. But I have them after learning a few definitions, a few elements of illuminated manuscripts. I set them free to be able to look through various items and to decide whether something is illuminated or not. So Will of Jimenez is from 1287, and it's a will that conveys to a monastery land, vineyards in Tudela, Spain. The monastery actually had a major role in the development of viticulture and wineries in the area. And below it is well past the period of medieval and Renaissance eras. But it shows, I like to still show it to students because an example of traditions that we still retain, that is still retained from the illuminated manuscript making tradition. You have the coat of arms, you have what is the ink that's supposed to resemble gold leaf. Well, it's written by hand, it's a bound manuscript. Although it's from 1680, it still retains that tradition, right? If you look at your e-readers, your Kindles, when you turn the page, you have the act of continuing to turn the page. There's even a swoosh sound that it makes, even though you are not really turning a page. So kind of retaining those traditions and practices to this very day. And for the samples, these are leather and vellum samples that I like to show the students to give them an idea, to tell the differences in textures between the smooth parchment of sheep and calf with the rougher textures of goat and deer. And I promise I will relate it to the end. So with artist books, I have a couple featuring foodies and a miniature artist book. Foodies is in a what's described as a trifold portfolio. So these individual letterpress printed folios contain original stories that explore the diversity of meaning in food-related language, and the stories are presented in the ingredients. So I show students that artist books, while they are inspired by the traditional structure of a book format. So that is used as a springboard to create their art pieces, to create their works. It can include entire narratives, stories, single quotations, single words, or no words at all. At the bottom is the wine, which is a miniature accordion, making use of a severed wine cork, a wine cork, serving as the boards of the book, and enclosed with has a belly band or a band enclosure. And it's a quotation from Homer's Odyssey, talking about the bewitching wine, which sets a wise man to singing and to laughing gently, and bring forth words which were originally left best unsaid. I also like to introduce non-Western texts to students, comparing the stitching, the bindings to, say, maybe something with Coptic stitching or sewing. The first item in black is the summary of grape cultivation. It's the first and only edition of this illustrated guide to grape cultivation written by Ozawa Zenpei, who was an important pioneer of wine in Japan. He was responsible for introducing over 100 varieties of grapes to Japan from overseas, especially from America, and discusses plant cultivation, preparation of the soil, care of wines, and the importance of selecting the variety of grapes according to the weather of the region. And also having students engage with the materials and showing how it's different from, say, Western texts. And again, you start in the beginning, which is what we would consider the back of the text, opening the text or the covers from the left to the right. And also with the illustrations, the students may not understand the text, but they can tell from the illustrations hints at Japanese culture. Normally, after work, you would partake in dinner parties, after work parties between associates, where the bosses would serve their employees and vice versa, the employees serving the employers. This is a way to cultivate and develop workplace relations, and hopefully the illustrations will show some evidence of that. So from there, I have to go to my manuscripts. This isn't necessarily focusing on the materiality of the items, but the content. I remember in library school, the course instructor, in discussing the differences between archivists and rare book librarians, he said that archivists, we tend to look at the significance of the content of the works, whereas rare book librarians focus on the bindings. It's a way for them, in the way that you uncover and unlayer the pieces of the bindings, the histories, the fragments that you might uncover. So I have to go back to my my beginning of my career, which was in manuscript collections, the personal papers of families, of individuals, the records of organizations. And I present here the Robert G. Mondavi papers. I like showing the research process, the drafting process that the creator used to maybe draft one of his speeches. From here, you will see notes, the transcript of a 60 Minutes program from 1991 on the French paradox, which is, why is it that the French diet that includes more butter, fats, than the American diet, why is it healthier than what we're experiencing in the U.S.? And they are, along with that, it focuses on red wine. From the C. Nelson Hackett papers, I like to feature, the Hackett family, the family donated Yolo County ranch land to the university. And from this collection, I like to feature what's called the Zero Family poster. I like to ask my printmaking classes to figure out or guess what decade this poster was produced in. Usually I get answers that it was from the 60s, but no, it's from 1908. And so it's a great example for printmaking students, typography students to look at. And I think I'm coming up to the end. So in coming up to the end, how do I convey, or what can I leave you with that's instructive? So I'm going to give you the recipe, the English translation of the recipe for chocolate as it was consumed by the Mesoamericans originally. But continuing along the vein of instruction, I also want to feature what's on my wish list. Remember when I told you that that sometimes I joke with students that, I don't know if I've gone through this, but I have 9 sections of my art history, medieval to Renaissance art classes visit special collections. By the 9th class, I'm tired, and I'll joke with the students that one of the samples is human skin. So one of the items, or the only item on my wish list, is a sample or a book bound in human skin, purely for instructive purposes. Thank you.
To repeat the question for Axel, what strategy do we use to collect the wine labels?
When I first started working with wine labels, I was overwhelmed, because after looking at several hundred, you get overwhelmed. There's just so many pieces of paper. The Maynard Amerine collection that you'll see examples out in our display is roughly 5,200 labels. But we have a label collection of 30,000 labels, and we have another label collection of somewhere around 60,000 labels. So initially, we were trying to just confine it to California. And when we were being given wine labels, of course, you want to be concerned about the condition, how they've been removed from the bottle, the state of the label, and all of that kind of thing. One of the things that Davis developed as sort of a prototype about 4 or 5 years ago was, and it was, I think, utilizing what New York Public did with their menu collection. And what we did was we photographed the 5,200 Amerine labels with high-resolution photography. Then we set up a crowdsourcing system to essentially capture the information off of the labels. If you notice with labels, there's a wide range of design and typography and all of these things. It makes OCR virtually impossible. So using crowdsourcing to capture that data, we've done that. Now what we're running into is a wine ontology. How do you get all the red wines? How do you get all the white wines? It's a very difficult thing to do, and it's something that we're currently working on. Strategy, getting back to strategy, at first it was fear when these things, and sort of how do we deal with them, and we know they're going to be taking up large collection, or large amount of space and all of that. But this new system that we have, we've proven that the technology works. We just need someone to donate $1 million so that we can start doing the rest of the labels and do the work on the ontology on that. I hope that answers.
Repeating for the recording, do you have a tactic or strategy to alert yourself to stolen material?
Very good question, because library land is rife with theft. And I think we all have examples in our own experience with items that have been stolen. There are collections that have been given to Davis that somehow items mysteriously disappeared. I would say that happened before my watch. But it's something that is that you have to be aware of. There was an interesting case that I had recently where I got an offer from a reputable dealer for a collection of several hundred letters involving a specific Bordeaux wine merchant, and it covered about a 30-year period back in the 1700s. And what they wanted for the collection was way beyond our means, so it wasn't anything that we considered. But about that time, I was interviewed by Jane Anson, who is Decanter's editor, who is resident in Bordeaux, and she's recently published a book about Bordeaux. So sort of in an offhand way, I said to her, oh, by the way, look at this, isn't this interesting? You know, something we'd never be able to afford, but, you know, it's something that's interesting out there. And she says, I know that producer, they're still around. So she went to them and said, you know, there's these letters from your organization. He says, yeah, I know they were stolen. They were stolen 100 years before. So they did contact the dealer, and the letters were returned to them. But I would say you have to be vigilant all the time on it, because it's very difficult at times to trace the provenance of things, and I do sometimes wonder about things. One of the things that Christine showed, the prophecy book, the manuscript book from 1620, drawing blank. Any case, if you look at the property stamp on it, now this was made in France for Louis XIV's Minister of War, and it prophesies quality of grape growing and wine vintages through the 21st century. But somehow it ended up in a Jewish library in Argentina, because there's a property stamp in there. And then we got it from somebody. It arrived long before I was in the library. So I kind of wonder on that, and it's just something that you have to be vigilant on. Do you want to say anything about?
Yeah, when talking to students about the provenance of certain items, I first preface it by saying that cultural institutions tend not to get involved in acquired things with murky provenance, but for instance, we do have a Sumerian clay tablet where it was purchased from a rare book shop in LA. And I asked questions, how do you think it landed in LA? From, let's say, the ruins of modern day Iraq. But, it was something that we acquired a long time ago, but as of now, we're not supposed to continue along those lines. Not like, Museum of the Bible. Anyone else?
I may add there's a couple over here as well. Yeah.
Front row.
How can someone use the library?
That's a wonderful question. That should be the first question. We're a land-grant institution, which means that we have a special charge to support the mechanical and agricultural industries of the state of California. This goes back to the 1860s. As a land-grant institution, and the remaining land-grant, the land-grant institution within the University of California was vested in 3 campuses, Berkeley, Davis, and Riverside. And the Davis campus, in the library especially, we take that very seriously till today. So anybody can come in and use the collection. Anybody can come into special collections and use the collection and special collections. Now, with the COVID pandemic, we've had to put restrictions and other kinds of things on it. I hope that it will, at some point, open up again. Also, when I was working, I was fielding questions from all around the world, and in some cases, some of these researchers would come to Davis, and I would spend time with them in the collection, working with the collection. So we provide a range of services that way. But in essence, this is a library that's held by a public institution in trust, and I would say in trust for the world, and we do take it at that level because our collection is international and in scope and has so many different languages in it. And it's been wonderful to see people come and use the collection. When the Soviet Union broke up, there were a number of Soviet-trained viticulturalists that came to work in California, in the nursery industries in particular. And these were people with PhD-level education in grape growing, for example. And they were coming to Davis and finding works in Russian that they did not know existed. They had never seen it in their home country, but we had copies of that. So it's always astounding to see. The big reward for me is seeing the surprise, the pleasant surprise that these people have when they use the collection. And I can go on and on about stories on that, but it really is, anybody can use it. We encourage people to use it, and we do have contact points so you can go to our websites and find out about submitting questions or getting in contact with a particular librarian to help you with that.
And I do emphasize in my classes, in every class, that the archives is there for them. I'm not sure about the rest of the library. For archives and special collections, you don't necessarily have to be affiliated with UC Davis or even with the UC. We have international scholars who come in all the time to study one of our anchor collections, the Gary Snyder papers. So, and I've heard recently that undergraduate students, well, even graduate students, have anxiety entering the library. So if they have anxiety with entering the library, how would they feel about the archives? So I do say and stress the importance that it is open to anyone. Do we have a future exhibit here? At the book fair, we have the exhibit on the end featuring our mini wine and food collections. And when I say it's at the very end, it's at the very end. We have around 10 cases, I think. And currently on campus, in front of our department, we have Julianne's Wine Writers collection, and then we have gems featuring examples from UC Davis, the photograph collection, University Archives photograph collection. Those are the two current exhibits, at least in Shields Library.
The Zero family invitation from 1908 has been made into a little bookmark that's down there, so you can take a copy of that home with you if you'd like. And I also believe that there are postcards utilizing images from Amerine's label collection. And one of them that's on display, it has the notes from the tasting, and he gave it a letter grade. I think it's a B+ for the wine. And he's noted as being a hard grader.
Where do you get your funding for your purchases, and how expensive can they be?
Where does the funding for purchases come from, and how expensive can they be?
So as a land-grant institution and a University of California institution, our money largely comes from the state. So the state budget pays for undergraduate education, and there's a certain amount of money that comes to the library for the acquisition of material and support of undergraduate education. What we're talking about is way beyond that. So we have some small endowments that we do have an active fundraising program. We've had a development officer now for a couple of years, I think about 7 years, although we had one, she left, and then we have another one now. So we are actively soliciting donations on that. Julianne Ballou, if you were here for her presentation, she's here because of a $3.3 million gift from Warren Winiarski of Stag's Leap Winery to the library. Recently, can I talk about the Beckstoffer?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, we were recently given $500,000 from Andy Beckstoffer. Andy Beckstoffer is the largest single owner of vineyard land in Napa. So we're out soliciting money. We're out hustling money on that. And that's what's going to fund a lot of these things. What's the most expensive thing that we purchased just recently? And it's is it on exhibit now?
Yes, it is.
It's on exhibit. It's a debate on wine and water from 1500.
You're putting me on the spot. 1550?
1550, $50,000. But $38,000 of that was a gift from the Breslauer Foundation, which funds purchase of rare material for libraries. Unfortunately, this is the last year that they're doing it, so we got under the wire on that one. But we're constantly looking for ways of funding these things, because this goes way beyond the state's mandate to fund things. And we are dependent upon the goodwill of others. Is that the right quote from the Tennessee Williams?
The kindness of strangers.
Yeah, kindness of strangers.
We do have time for one more question.
I'll say one last thing on the Breslauer thing. I'm talking with Julianne, and in the earlier presentation, she said it was wonderful because it was one of the easiest grant proposals that she wrote, and she actually got some help indirectly from UC San Diego and the head of special collections there, Linda Klassen. But it's proving to be much harder to get the university to accept it because we did not follow university protocol and procedure on that. So we're learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.